So, you think I'm crazy? Well, back in the day, if you were gay, you were considered crazy. They put you away in an institute. My guest today is Robert C. Steele, and he wrote a biography about these events. My name is Eric, and you're about to hear the craziness that lives inside my head. Okay, so today we're going to talk to Robert C. Steele and about his book, Banned from California, Jim Foshee,
Foshee.
Persecution, Foshee, Persecution, Redemption, Liberation, and the Gay Civil Rights Movement. So, explain to us, what is this book about?
Well, um, Jim lived a very different life than what I've lived. Jim and I met as activists in the early 1970s gay liberation movement, and it's about Jim's life. Jim was born in 1939, and he eventually became an LGBTQ activist and a researcher in the early 1970s gay liberation movement. And at 15 years old, he ran away from an abusive home life in Idaho, and he landed in 1950s Los Angeles's underground world of homosexuals and early queer culture. And he unwittingly ended up an eyewitness to the beginning of the LGBTQ civil rights movement. And in this book, Banned from California, readers experience Jim's adventures and misadventures and live history as seen through the eyes of this gay American.
Um, what made you write the book at this time, opposed to writing it, let's say, in the 90s?
Well, in the 1990s, I did a series of interviews of Jim for Banned from California. And at that time, I was working full time, and I simply did not want to work on the book in my evenings and on my weekends and work my life away. So then it was about 20 years later, after I retired, that I earnestly began writing the book. About 6 or 7 years ago, I realized that I had to start getting Banned from California written and published. I absolutely could not let this story be lost to history. It was just too important a story that absolutely had to be told and offered to people. So, uh, for my book, I researched historical records and government documents and personal letters and audio recordings. And even though Banned from California is a biography about Jim's life, it's really a lot more than that. It's a book about a certain time in LGBTQ history and the culture and history of the LGBTQ civil rights movement in the USA serves as a backdrop for Jim's life and all of his many, many travels. And we see 70 years of American culture through the eyes of this gay American. Now, most LGBT history books or gay history books are written in a more academic style, and a lot of readers find that style to be somewhat dry and harder to plod through. So instead, I wrote Banned from California in a first person, you are there style. And a lot of readers have said that that makes it a very easy read and a lot more captivating read.
Okay, now, why did you call it Banned from California? Was he really banned from California?
Yes, he was born in 1939, but at 15 years old, he ran away to 1950s Los Angeles. And while he was there, he got caught up with the cops who thought that he was being abused by an older gay man in his 20s. And so Jim was put in, in an institution for young men that was essentially a jail. And he was awaiting his trial. And he finally went for the court hearing, and to come find out, it wasn't a trial about what he did wrong. It was a trial that he saw a couple of friends in the audience who had helped him, and the authorities had claimed that Jim had been abused, sexually abused by these men, which was not the truth. And Jim told the court in his testimony, no, it's not true. They didn't do it. The police made me say it. And the judge got mad and told the bailiff that he wanted to see Jim in his chambers. So he called a recess, and he talked to Jim and said, now we can go back into the courtroom and disregard your earlier testimony. You've upset things. We could have put this man away for years. I just don't understand why you're doing this. And Jim said, no, I won't. And the judge got mad and said, this is a disgrace. You're a disgrace. You can never come back here to California. I ban you from the state of California.
No, but in all honesty, can he really? Can he really ban? I mean, I'm just curious. Can a judge really ban someone from a state?
Not really. But the judge was saying that to Jim because Jim was a kid, and Jim didn't know any better. He thought that he truly was banned from California, and of course, nobody can be banished from a state nowadays. That would never hold up in court.
Okay. So was he part of the Stonewall Revolution, so to speak?
Well, actually, pretty much. He moved to Denver, and that coincided with a new robust national discourse on homosexuality. And the Stonewall uprising occurred right about a month after Jim arrived in Denver. And the counterculture movement was growing, and gay civil rights groups were organizing across the country. So Jim decided to get involved, and he found a cause worth living for. Jim was no longer at the mercy of the persecution around him. And now he took control of his own life by putting his destiny in his own hands.
Okay. Now, the other question about talking about gay history, is there anything in the book about the AIDS epidemic that was going on in the 80s?
Yes, Jim was about ready to move from Denver in the early 1980s when the AIDS epidemic began. And a chapter in the book, through my research, I included information about how the AIDS epidemic affected the people in Denver that Jim knew. And after Jim moved from Denver, he made a trip back months later, and Denver had changed. It was caught up in the beginnings of the AIDS epidemic, and one of Jim's very best friends had AIDS and eventually died of AIDS.
Yes. That was, I don't know how young this audience is, but that AIDS epidemic, I mean, it's interesting now we have a COVID, 19 epidemic. And I've had interesting conversation with so-called straight people who keep saying that it's not the same, but it was an epidemic. I mean, it may not affect straight people the way COVID-19 is affecting them, but now I guess now what they're going through is what a lot of gay men went through back in the 80s. I mean,
I
some
agree.
gay, yeah,
The AIDS epidemic has a lot of similarities to the COVID pandemic. And you and I can see those similarities because we lived through it. In fact, I lost about half of my friends during the AIDS epidemic. And of course, now you and I are older in our 70s, and we have friends that nowadays are dying of old age diseases. And, and so there's a lot of similarities. I absolutely agree.
yeah. I mean, there's one guy I work with. I mean, he was adamant about it. It's not the same. It's not the same. And I said, well, it is the same. I mean, he goes because he claimed what make it different because you could prevent AIDS by not having unsafe sex. And I said, well, the way the government's carrying on, if you're not vaccinated and wearing a mask, you can get COVID. I mean, I don't see, just because you put the sex in it, what's the difference? I mean, and then again, a lot of gay men had unsafe sex, and a lot of them are still alive today. So it's just one of those things. The other thing is, when did he die? What year did he die?
Jim barely made it to 2006. He died on New Year's Day, 2006.
Oh, okay. So, do you have a chapter on what he went through in the 90s? Because the 90s was, I think, was more liberating for gay men in the 90s. And I should say LGBT community in the 90s. I mean, Ellen came out in the 90s, right?
Yes. The end of the book talks about the 90s and the early 2000s and what Jim did. He moved from Denver, where he found love and happiness, and he moved down to Arizona, and he lived in Arizona and Southern California the last 2 decades of his life, and he saw a lot of things that improved. Of course, he died before he saw gay marriage being legalized nationwide, but he saw 80 years of change.
Yes. Now, out of curiosity, this is his biography. Would you say that it's on the same level as putting it, let's say, in a history library for gay life?
Yes, I definitely would. I think that, as I said, it's not just a story about Jim, but in essence, it's also an in-depth story about the gay movement and the LGBT movement beginning and how he experienced it and how it shaped itself. It pretty much started, of all things, with the new gay press at that time.
Yes. Yes. Especially in the 80s. The gay press was, I think it was a lot of gay press in the 80s compared to now. That's my opinion.
Yeah, a lot then. And also, it began actually in the 1950s. The true turning point in these times was the rise of the gay press. And in the 1950s, it was really a radical new type of publication that permeated the whole fledgling gay civil rights movement. And it was a little known magazine nowadays. It was called One Magazine that first began publishing in 1950s. In fact, in 1953, and it was the first enduring gay publication in the USA. By 1957, about 3,000 monthly copies were printed, and they were sold through subscriptions and also at newsstands. And it essentially marked the true beginning of the gay press. One positioned itself into the forefront of the emerging queer movement, and it awakened homosexuals nationwide for the first time. Most straight people were unaware of One magazine, but straight people who paid attention to it were scared of the magazine. Now, instead of finding a communist under every bed, they were finding a queer there. So here's an interesting story for you. A couple of years after One started publishing, the US Post Office impounded the magazine's October 54 edition. And the post office called the magazine obscene and filthy. And the post office refused to deliver One magazine through the mail. So One took the post office to court in Los Angeles, and they lost. The judge ruled that the magazine was calculated to stimulate the lust of homosexual readers. And so One appealed the judge's ruling to the US Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, and they lost again. The appeals court ruled that articles in the magazine were nothing more than cheap pornography, morally depraved and debased. So after these two legal setbacks, One staff members were absolutely dejected and dispirited, but One's attorney wanted to take their court case, of all things, to the US Supreme Court. So One's staff members were pessimistic, but they okayed their attorney's plan of action. And then eventually the Supreme Court handed down its ruling. It did not even hear oral arguments, but the Supreme Court ruled unanimously in One's favor. The High Court reversed the two lower court opinions, and it essentially ruled that One magazine's discussion of homosexuality was not obscene, and that it was an exercise of free speech, that homosexuals had the same right to freedom of the press as anybody else in the USA. And so this was the first legal victory for homosexuals in the US Supreme Court, which was a very liberal court at that time. And that important landmark decision actually made it possible for homosexual publications to exist, which allowed the equal rights for homosexual movement to develop and advance. And One magazine fought and won that crucial initial battle.
Oh, that's great. One, I would like to, you and I discussed a while back that he was institutionalized for being gay, right?
Yes, that's right. I detail Jim's young life in Banned from California about the institutionalizations. First, he was institutionalized when he was placed in an orphanage when he was 3. Jim's older sister, Ruthie, was 8 years old at the time, and she was institutionalized in the orphanage with him. And she'd already experienced the loss of her daddy, who had died the year before. And then in the orphanage, she had to deal with the emotional trauma of being alone in a strange place without either parent. And Jim was so young, at 3 years old, that he told me he really did not remember anything about entering the orphanage. So he did not remember how he initially dealt with it. But after 3 years, the kids spent in the orphanage, Jim's mother brought the kids back home to live with her, and they settled in together. But Jim couldn't remember anything about his mother before living in the orphanage. He said that she seemed like a nice lady, but he couldn't remember anything about her. And he told me he really didn't think he was really capable of bonding with her because he had already lived half of his young life at the orphanage without his mother. And so, anyway, his mother married Jim's first stepfather, whose discipline that he metered out amounted to beating Jim and his sister whenever he thought the two children came under the influence of the devil.
Mm.
And this apparently happened so often that during one particular 3-day period, Jim ran away from home every day. So then at about age 13, Jim was placed in a reform school, another institution, this time to correct his runaway tendencies and other incorrigible behavior. And the older juvenile delinquents took sexual advantage of Jim. Jim felt that he couldn't really tell these older guys no. So then the reform school staff found out that a lot of the older guys were having sex with Jim, and the house fathers thought Jim was at fault and told him that he was a bad influence on the older juvenile delinquents.
Mm.
So the training school's medical staff determined that Jim was mentally ill with severe social maladjustment problems, and the system transferred the 14-year-old out of the reform school and into Idaho's state mental hospital. And so from then through the rest of his teenage years, Jim lived mainly at that mental institution. And that Idaho Mental Hospital was a fairly progressive medical institution during the 1960s. They eventually concluded that Jim was not mentally ill, but their main concern about Jim was that they were afraid that he was becoming institutionalized at the mental hospital. And so they tried various techniques to integrate him back into society. However, Jim was a lot more comfortable away from home and away from society and couldn't wait to get back to the mental hospital where his real friends lived. He couldn't be truthful and tell people outside the hospital who he really was, because after all, not only was he gay and running off to California, but he was living most of his teenage life in a mental institution.
Okay. So to end this, what would you say to a young gay person of 21 why they should read this book?
Well, as Jim said, almost every gay person he'd ever known has suffered to some extent at the hands of their heterosexual parents. And his childhood and teenage years clearly qualified him as an abused child at the hands of his fundamentally religious mother and his sadistic first stepfather. So I would tell the young LGBTQ people to keep from losing our equal rights. We are going to have to be vigilant and even still in this day, constantly fight for our rights or they will be taken away. In fact, right now, legal briefs written by conservative right-wing lawyers are encouraging the US Supreme Court to not only overturn Roe versus Wade, but also overturning Lawrence versus Texas that ruled that state laws banning homosexual sodomy are unconstitutional as outlawing states, and also overturning Obergefell versus Hodges that granted LGBT people the right to same-sex marriage. So people don't realize that those two current rights can easily be overturned by the Supreme Court. So we must stand vigilant, and they need to get involved. And if nothing else, go out and vote during every national election. And if possible, get involved in the LGBTQ rights movement and put your destiny in your own hands, and you'll feel a lot better about it, and you'll have a true cause worth living for.
Well put, Robert C. Steele. Thank you for visiting us and talking about your book, Banned from California. And I just want to end the show saying that, ladies and gentlemen, you just heard the craziness that lives inside my head.